To understand what happened inside that house, you have to understand the life Christopher Coleman had built around it. From the outside, it looked enviable. He had married his high school sweetheart, Sherry Weiss, in 1996. They had 2 sons together, Garrett, 11, and Gavin, 9. Coleman worked as the head of executive security for Joyce Meyer Ministries, a global Christian organization headquartered just outside St. Louis. The job paid him roughly $100,000 a year. He traveled the world. He carried a firearm. He answered directly to one of the most recognized religious figures in the country. His employer had one immovable rule. Anyone caught in adultery would be terminated, not warned, not counseled, terminated. That single clause in his employment contract is the silent engine running underneath everything that followed. Remember it. By 2008, Coleman had begun an affair with a woman named Tara Lintz, a former classmate of his wife who lived in Florida. They exchanged thousands of text messages. He told her he loved her. He told her he wanted to marry her. He told her he was going to leave Sherry, but there was a problem. Divorce, in the eyes of his employer, was almost as damaging as adultery. A man who could not lead his own household could not be trusted to guard the ministry's most prominent figure. A divorce would not just end his marriage. It would end his career, his salary, his lifestyle, and his identity as the dependable Christian husband everyone admired. In the months before the murders, something else began to happen. Threatening notes started arriving. Emails warning Coleman to repent. Messages claiming his family would pay for his sins. Coleman reported them to police. He even asked a fellow officer to help him install surveillance cameras around the house. To anyone watching, it looked like a family under siege by a religious extremist. But here is what nobody noticed at the time. Every threat arrived only when Coleman himself was somewhere it could not be traced back to him. And the cameras he installed had one strange blind spot: the back of the house. We will return to that detail in a moment, because it is where the case ultimately broke open. The morning of May 5, 2009 began before sunrise. Coleman left the house at approximately 5:43 a.m. and drove to a local gym called Gold's Gym in Columbia. He swiped his membership card at 5:54. Surveillance footage showed him on a treadmill, then lifting weights. He texted Sherry. She did not respond. He texted again, still nothing. According to him, this was unusual. He called a neighbor and police officer named Justin Barlow and asked him to check the house. Officer Barlow arrived just before 7:00 a.m. He looked through the windows. He saw red spray-painted messages on the walls. Words like "punished" and "you have paid" scrawled across the family's home. He drew his weapon and waited for backup. When officers entered the home minutes later, they found Sherry, Garrett, and Gavin in their beds. All 3 had been killed by ligature strangulation. The killer had taken the time to write the threatening messages on the bedroom walls and on the bedsheets themselves. When Coleman was told, he did not collapse. He did not scream. He sat on a curb outside the home with his arms folded and asked the officer standing beside him whether he could go inside to get a drink of water. Witnesses on scene later described his composure as eerie, not numb, but contained, like a man waiting for a meeting to start. That same afternoon, he agreed to be interviewed by Major Case Squad detectives. He was articulate. He volunteered information. He cried at appropriate moments. And he repeated again and again that a stalker had killed his family. He pointed investigators toward the threatening emails. He pointed them toward members of his church he found suspicious. And then he made a decision that would, in hindsight, become the single most damaging mistake of his life. He agreed to let detectives examine his phone, his computer, and his home. He believed they would find nothing. He was wrong, and what they found was only half the story. The first crack appeared within 48 hours. Detectives traced the threatening emails Coleman had received over the previous months. The IP addresses led not to a stalker, not to a religious extremist, but to networks Coleman himself had access to, including his employer's offices and a hotel in Tampa, Florida, where he had stayed during a trip with Tara Lintz. He had been writing the threats himself. He was the stalker. Investigators then turned to the surveillance cameras Coleman had installed around his own home. The recordings revealed something peculiar. On the night of the murders, no one entered the home from the front, the sides, or the front-facing back patio. The only path not covered was a narrow corridor along the rear of the house, the one path Coleman walked every night when he took out the trash. There was no forced entry, no broken windows, no sign of struggle anywhere in the house. The doors had been locked from the inside. Then came the dog. The Coleman family kept a pet inside the home. Detectives spoke with neighbors. No one, not one neighbor on a quiet suburban street, had heard the dog bark that night. A stranger entering a home in the dark to commit 3 murders would have set off any dog. The animal's silence pointed to one terrible conclusion. Whoever killed Sherry, Garrett, and Gavin was someone the dog already knew. The phone records told the rest. In the weeks before the murders, Coleman had searched online for information about strangulation, about how long it takes a body to be discovered, and about Illinois divorce law. He had told Tara Lintz in writing that he would be free by May. The murders occurred on May 5. By the time Coleman attended the joint funeral for his wife and sons, investigators were already building their case. Cameras at the service captured something the public would not see for months. As mourners filed past the 3 caskets, one adult, 2 small, Coleman appeared composed. At one moment, family members later testified he turned to a relative and smiled. Not a sad smile, not the brittle smile of a man holding himself together. A relaxed social smile, the kind you give at a wedding. Prosecutors would later argue that this single image revealed everything about the man. He had not lost his family. In his mind, he had finally been freed of them. He was arrested 11 days after the murders. The trial began in April 2011. Most people get the next part completely wrong, so listen carefully. When most people hear the term family annihilator, they imagine a man snapping under pressure, a breakdown, a loss of control. The research tells a very different story. Forensic psychologist Dr. Neil Webstill, who has studied dozens of these killers, identifies a specific subtype he calls the civil reputable annihilator. These are men who appear stable, successful, and devoutly committed to family life. Their crimes are not impulsive. They are the result of months of cold, deliberate planning. The murders are to them a form of accounting, a way of erasing one life so they can begin another without the social cost of a public divorce or scandal. Christopher Coleman fits this subtype almost perfectly. He did not kill in rage. He killed on schedule. He killed at a moment that gave him a documented alibi. He killed in a way he believed could be blamed on someone else. He attempted to construct a parallel narrative, the persecuted Christian family man, months before the act itself. Psychologists call this narrative preconstruction, and it is one of the most consistent markers of premeditated familicide in this category. There is also the matter of empathy. During his interrogation, recorded and later released to the public, Coleman was asked about his sons. He answered in flat, generic phrases. He could describe their schedules. He struggled to describe who they were. One detective later said it was the moment he became certain. A grieving father loses words. A guilty one loses warmth. What about the smile? Behavioral analysts describe what is called duping delight, a brief, involuntary expression of pleasure that surfaces in deceptive individuals when they believe they are successfully manipulating the people around them. It can flash for less than a second. It often appears when the deceiver feels the conversation has shifted in their favor. The footage from the funeral, played for the jury, became one of the most powerful pieces of non-physical evidence in the trial. Here is the part that haunts the investigators to this day. In the months before the murders, Sherry Coleman had told a friend she suspected her husband was unfaithful. She had begun, quietly, to look at her own options. Some have wondered whether she had begun to see through him, whether that was the moment her timeline ran out. Drop it in the comments. When you watch interviews of people accused of horrific crimes, what is the one detail that always tips you off that something is wrong? CTA 1213 Min. If you find yourself drawn to cases like this, cases where the most dangerous person in the room is the one suspects, consider subscribing to CrimeDossier. Every week we walk through the cases the headlines simplified, the clues the public never heard, and the patterns that connect them. Subscribing costs nothing. It only tells the algorithm to keep bringing these stories to people who actually want to understand them. That is how this channel grows, and that is how more cases get the careful attention they deserve. Outro 1315 Min. Christopher Coleman was convicted on May 5, 2011, exactly 2 years to the day after the murders. He was sentenced to 3 consecutive terms of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. He has never confessed. He has never apologized. He has filed multiple appeals, all of them denied. What this case reveals is something most of us would prefer not to know, that the most catastrophic violence inside a family rarely arrives from a stranger climbing through a window. It arrives far more often from someone who has already memorized the alarm code. Someone who has rehearsed the grief he plans to perform. Someone who, when the worst day of his life is supposed to be unfolding around him, cannot quite stop himself from smiling. The threatening messages on the walls of the Coleman home were meant to point investigators toward an outside enemy. In the end, they pointed only inward, toward a man who had spent months planning the disappearance of the people who loved him most, and who believed until the very last moment that he had been clever enough to get away with it. If this case stayed with you, my breakdown of the Chris Watts case will land even harder now, because once you have seen the pattern in Coleman, you will start to see it everywhere. Watch that one next. The similarities are not a coincidence. On May 5, 2009, in Columbia, Illinois, Sherry Coleman and her two young sons Garrett and Gavin were found murdered in their beds. The threatening messages spray-painted on the walls suggested a stalker. The grieving father, an elite bodyguard for one of America's most powerful televangelists, gave calm interviews and attended the funeral with composure. But investigators noticed something nobody else did, and what they uncovered would expose one of the most coldly calculated cases of family annihilation in modern American crime. This is the full story of Christopher Coleman, the staged threats, the silent dog, the IP addresses that pointed back at him, and the chilling psychology of the civil reputable family annihilator. Calm, factual, and based entirely on court records, trial testimony, and verified reporting. Subscribe to CrimeDossier for weekly deep-dive documentaries on cold cases, criminal psychology, and forensic investigations. Timestamps: 0000 the hook 0030 who was Christopher Coleman 03 00 the morning of May 5 06 00 the investigation cracks open 09 00 the psychology of a family annihilator 12 00 what this case really means 13 30 what to watch next.